Well, good evening. Tonight we're looking at Psalm chapter 44. If you have your Bibles, we'll be reading a lot tonight in Psalm chapter 44. The nation is facing a national crisis. Evidently, they have been defeated in battle and being routed by the enemy. The crisis serves as a wake-up call and for introspection. The problem, as far as from the perspective of the nation, is that they don't understand why they're going through this suffering and being defeated. And so they'll begin to ask, what have we done? Have we been unfaithful to God? Have we broken his covenant? Have we sinned? And when they address the sin in the nation, they're talking about both overt sin, that is what you'd see on the streets, what you would hear in the media, and also they're asking about internal sin. For example, maybe like Achan, if you remember that story in the book of Judges, where, or rather Joshua, where he had hidden the spoils of a forbidden, in the forbidden city of Jericho. And so they're even asking if something has been done covertly that they're not certain about or they don't know anything about. So this is what the psalm is doing. And as you look at that, they just can't come up with a reason. There's no explanation. And a lot of times when we're going through some difficult times and some adversity in our life, it's just natural almost to begin to question why. And when you begin searching and you start thinking, there's nothing that I've done, I don't deserve this, I'm suffering unjustly, but nevertheless, it's something that we want to ask God about. Why is this happening? Why did you let this happening? So this is sort of the context of Psalm 44. And the puzzling thing about it is there's not an answer given. I mean, we could give some reasons, I think, about why people suffer and why we go through adversity. And some of those things may seem to be practical, but sometimes there just isn't an answer. And you can search high and low and look under everything, and there's just absolutely no answer why we're going through it. And so what you're left with is simply trusting God, and you're going to see as you go through this psalm, and it reads like a pretty dark thing, you're going to see. And when you get to the end of it, though, as dark as it is, they still go back to God and ask God to deliver them. Now, let me say something else before we start reading here. If the Bible's not true, then this is certainly a psalm I would put in it, because when you look at it, you might question, why would anybody ever address God like this writer does? And why would God even permit something like this in the Bible? Well, the reason it's in the Bible because it is inspired. So let's begin reading in Psalm chapter 44 tonight. I hope you have your Bibles because it's sort of a lengthy psalm, and we'll just read through this. Now, in verse 1, we have heard, and they're remembering what they had heard. Remembrance good, you know, and we have heard with our ears. This thing has been passed down to them. We need to pass down some good things, you see. Now watch it here. God, we have heard of the God of our fathers, how our fathers have told us that the work you had done previously in the past, all those wonderful acts that God had done, those great deeds, they were passed down from one generation to another generation, from Moses to Joshua and on down. And so they had heard about all these miraculous and wonderful works that God had delivered them from. And notice again in verse number 2 how, and he begins to describe some of these, and you're familiar with these if you're a Bible student, but how thou didst drive out the heathen with thy hand. Now I want you to notice something. He's referring, of course, when they went into the promised land, and God had driven out, you see, the enemy, those Canaanites. And of course, God was using the nation to do that. I mean, they just didn't leave on their own. I mean, they didn't go into the promised land and nobody was there. They had to fight, but God had delivered them in the battles. And of course, that puzzles them now because God is not delivering them out of the battle, and they're just puzzled by it. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the verse, but watch it here. He says, thou hast delivered with thine hand. So they understand that it was by God's hand that the enemy was driven out. The question, of course, where is he now? Now, and notice this, not only did he drive out the enemy, but he planted the fathers in that land. Now, if you go back to Deuteronomy, it's a great chapter because it's really a spiritual commentary on the law and how that Moses had warned them and how they were to act and what they were to remember. And if you go back in that book, I'll just mention one thing. He said you didn't get the land because you're special or you're better than somebody else or you're more self-righteous or more righteous than others. God had given them the land, see, and so what Moses is trying to do. Don't start thinking that you just because of who you are that God had delivered the enemy from you and put you in the land. They didn't get it because they deserve it, and you don't get to heaven because you deserve it. Well, you get to heaven because you're depending on God and what Jesus had done on the cross. Let's just don't forget that. Now, and notice this, how thou did afflict the people, that is the people, the Canaanites. And of course, what you would see about those folks, they had become so wicked and so evil that it was time for God to act against them and drive them out. And so he says, you cast them out. Now, verse 3. For they got not into the land or the possession by their own sword. There you go again. It wasn't by their might or by their power, but God had given them the possession. And then he goes on to say that neither did their own arms save them. Of course, it was the right hand of God. And by the light of thy countenance, that is, God was blessing them. That simply means there. If you see someone looking at in a dark way, that's not a good thing. Now notice verse 4. Thou art my king, O God, command deliverance for Jacob. Now, do you notice something as this prayer is beginning? And it's probably not David that's writing this, but at any rate, do you notice what's going on here? He's speaking of God, how God had delivered the people from their enemies and how God had gave them the land. And he knows it was by the power of God and they didn't do it themselves. That reminds me, doesn't it, you of Ephesians chapter 2, where he talks about, by grace through faith are you saved. It is not of yourself. It is the gift of God. So we got to remember that, don't we? And that's exactly what this writer is saying. They got into the land and possessed the land, and God planted them in the land by grace. It was a gift. Now, thou King, O God, command deliverance for Jacob. That's exactly what he's saying. God had delivered those people. Now, verse 5, though King James, through thee will we push down our enemies. And again, you see who they're trusting in, who they believe their strength is, where the power is. Through thy name we will tread them under, and they rise up against us. See, again, they believed if they lived the way that God wanted them to live. And I must say this and insert this right now, and we can't get into it too deeply tonight, but Israel had a special relationship with God. No other nations ever had it. God had made a covenant with the nation. You can read about that in the book of Deuteronomy and Exodus. And God simply said it in this way: I will bless you if you be obedient and keep the law, but if you disobey, you'll be cursed. And so they're wondering how in the world we kept the covenant, we haven't broken it. They're not saying they're sinless, obviously, but we haven't done anything that would violate the covenant where God would not deliver us. And so they're pondering that. They're wondering why, and they just can't come up with an answer. Now, for I will not trust in my bow, verse 6. They're not trusted in their own power. It's easy to do that. I know people do it all the time. They trust in their possessions or their money or well, we could just make a whole list, couldn't we? And so what he's saying is we haven't trusted in our bow or our military might or our cleverness or ingenuity or who we think we are. We didn't do that. So he says, I will not trust in my bow, neither my sword save me. I'm telling you what, this this thing here doesn't bother us at all. I mean, everything he said so far, we would agree with totally. And notice then in verse number 7, but thou hast saved us from our enemies and put them to shame that hated us. Do you see that? And so those are all pretty good things. God is on their side and God's driven out the enemy. Notice verse 8. In God we boast all the day long. How about that? They gloried in God. They bragged about God. God was their glory. And then they talked to the other people. God is our power. God is our security. I mean, this guy's talking the right kind of stuff. But thou hast saved us from our enemies, put them to shame that hated us. In God will we boast all the day long and praise his name forever and ever and ever. Then you see that little pause, Selah there. And what you do there, when you read those verses, you begin to reflect and ponder what has been said. Well, what's going on here? God had delivered the fathers, from the enemies, and he was blessed, and they were blessed because they kept the law and they kept the covenant. And so you see, they're perplexed now. They just can't understand why things are going wrong, because they feel that somehow God has deserted them and God's behind the problem. Now, verse number 9. Notice this is where it gets a little tougher, doesn't it? I mean, if you're reading along and thinking through this a little bit, these verses get to be pretty tough. Now watch. But thou hast cast us off. How come? Why? And put us to shame. We've been boasted of you. You're our God. You are the sovereign of the universe. Everything you see is in your hand. Nothing happens unless you permit it. And so they're saying, we boasted of you, boasted of your acts, and yet thou goest not forth with us against the enemies. Now, verse number 10. Thou makest to turn back from the enemy. Things didn't go well, did they? And they hate us to spoil. I mean, the enemy came in and they're like marauders and took the spoils. I mean, they defeated them and they're taking stuff from them. And then verse number 11. Thou hast given us like sheep. I mean, like they're helpless. I mean, like there's no defense. I mean, they must have been utterly defeated and appointed for food, and has scattered us among the heathen. I mean, they really got routed. Then verse number 12. And notice this. Boy, this is a painful thought, isn't it? Thou sellest thy people for nothing. Now, I want you to see how I've been saying as we travel through the Psalms, that you could say anything to God, and this person is a godly person, and they're praying to God, and then he's saying, God, you've sold us out like we're worth nothing. I mean, think about that. Think about how heartfelt and how realistic that is. God, you have done nothing to us. We're like nothing. And we've been sold out, you see, for absolutely nothing. Isn't that really something? Now, I'll tell you what, one thing you got to learn in prayer is to be real and be honest. And this writer is pouring out his feelings. And I think that sometimes if our prayers are just pious paddling, we ain't going to speak like this. God, why have you deserted me? Why have you left me? Why did you let this happen? Don't I mean anything? And that's how he's speaking. Now, in verse number 12, and I know that that's a hard way to pray, isn't it? It really is. Now, you keep in mind that these prayers aren't just private prayers, because these prayers find themselves in the worship service. These were songs, these were Hebrew hymns, Hebrew poetry, and they were read in worship service. And so it's not like you're just in a closet saying these things, but these would have been, in fact, you can see right from as you go through the pronouns, we, are, all of that, it's a community or corporate prayer. Now, then again, let's go down to verse 13. Now, if you're thinking through that, that ought to cause us to ponder a little bit. And if you're looking at your prayer life and being able to pray in a realistic way and go to God and pour out your feelings and what you truly feel. I mean, what you really, truly feel. Now, verse number 13, and thou hast made us a reproach to our neighbors. Do you see how dark these verses are? He's saying to God, you have made us a reproach, a scorn to the enemies, and derision. I mean, they're laughing about us. And I'll tell you what, it looks like the day might come where people on the street, the secular community, is laughing at the church of God. And you begin to wonder, God, how can you let that happen? Notice verse number 14. And thou hast made us a laughing stock or a byword among the people, and shaking of the head of the people. Isn't it getting dark here now? Now, verse 15. My confusion is continually before me. I don't get it. I don't understand it. I mean, I'm looking for an answer and I can't find one. And now, verse 16. For the voice of him that approaches and blasphemies by reason of the enemy and the avenger. And so, you might be saying something like this. Well, as you're going through things and the enemy's laughing at you and it doesn't look like God has any care for you and God can't do anything for you and God is not able, and the people are saying, where's your God now? And all of that kind of stuff. That's just exactly what this fellow feels like. Now, verse 17. And all this has come upon us, and yet you have forgot, you have not, let me read it slowly. All of this has come upon us, yet have we not forgotten thee. Hey, well, we haven't forgotten you, God. We haven't broken the covenant. We're not like a whole lot of people, that have lived without you and don't think about you and don't worship you. We're not guilty of that. We haven't forgotten you, God. Neither have we dealt falsely of the covenant. You see, again, coming back to that covenant idea that God had a covenant with those people, and so God had made promises and curses with those people. Now, you just keep in mind, God hadn't done that with any other nation. And so it's rather perilous and very, at least questionable, that when we go through a national crisis, that we can say God is behind it. Now, he may be. God is God of everybody. I mean, but you can't put your finger on this, that we're going through the COVID crisis because God is angry at us. He may be and he may not be. But I'll tell you what, when you go back into the nation of Israel, those were those covenant promises, and God told them exactly what would happen if they did this or failed to do that. So you got to keep it in the context there. Now, verse number 18, our heart is not turned back. So that comes back to what we said earlier, doesn't it? You can't look at anything openly. There's not things going on that we're guilty of. We're not worshiping idols. We're not going after foreign gods. There's no secret sin like Achan going on, and so they're puzzled. They're just puzzled about the whole business. Now, our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined in thy way. Now, verse number 19. Though thou hast sore broken us in the place of jackals. Old King James says dragons. He ain't talking about dragons. He's talking about jackals. And covered us with the shadow of death. I mean, things are really, really bad. Now, you read this and you don't understand because you're not going through it. Now, let me just say something here. Suffering and adversity is always academic and philosophical till it happens to you. Let me tell you, it stops being philosophical and academic when it starts touching you or people that you know and people that you love. And so they're going through this, and it's a very dark time, and they just don't understand how it could be happening. And that's the problem so many different times. Listen, let me tell you something. There's a lot of things that go on. God's ways are above our ways, and you can't, his steps are untraceable, Romans chapter 11. There's things that you can't figure out, but I want you to understand it doesn't mean that God didn't care about them, and God didn't love them, and God wasn't unable to deliver them. And so there are some things that happen, you see, that we might be puzzled by. And maybe, in the Bible, when this whole business is over, he'll tell us, or maybe he won't. I mean, maybe at that time we won't even care. I have an idea that a lot of things we get concerned about right now, we won't care about at all later. Now, verse number 20. If we have forgotten thy name, O God, or stretched out thy hands to a strange God, we haven't done that. We haven't forgotten you, and we haven't worshipped some foreign God. Notice verse 21. Shall not God search this out? In other words, if we were doing it, God would know it. Think about that. I mean, there's nothing that God doesn't know, and He knows just if we done something, He know it. That's all we're saying. For He knoweth the secrets of the heart. He knows what's going on down the corner of the street and down those dark alleys. He knows what's going on at the nightclub. He knows that. He can see it, but He also can see into our heart. And that's so very important, you see, to keep the heart, you see, pure before God. Now, verse 22. Yea, for thy sake. Now notice this, for thy sake. In other words, we've been faithful. We've been loyal to you. Yet we are killed all the day long. Do you see the perplexity there? Now listen, they've gone through it, and you might go through it if you haven't been through it already. And as you try to find an answer, there isn't one. We've been faithful to you. We've worshiped you. We're living right. We believe in the Bible. We believe in God. We believe that Jesus is the Christ. And yet we're going through some things that we just can't figure out. And so did they. Now, and we are counted like sheep for the slaughter. No, and by the way, we can't get into this tonight, but that's a quotation that Paul uses over in Romans chapter 8. Now, now look here. Now you get down to where the writer, the prayer, the psalmist is saying this, awake, O thou sleepest. Now, he doesn't believe that God sleeps. God never sleeps. We need to sleep. We have to sleep. We can't go very long without sleep. But God doesn't sleep. He's just using this as a way to say, pay attention to what's going on, or try to get God's attention. Arise, arise, don't cast us off forever. Verse 24, wherefore hidest thou face? You see the question again? Do you see it? Why are you hiding? Why are you hiding your face from us? And forget our affliction and our oppression. Now, in reality, God knew what was going on, and He did forget. So whatever reason God had there, they don't know it, but God had a reason for it. Now it's verse 25. And by the way, as we're going through this, I don't want to be redundant, but you see how he's pouring out his soul to God, and how he's saying, God, we don't understand. We've been faithful to you. We don't know why this is going on, and there's no answer. There's no explanation. You don't hear a voice. You can't reason it out. You're just left in the dark, so to speak. There is absolutely no answer at all, but you still trust Him. Now, for our soul is bowed down to the dust. That gets you down to the dirt, doesn't it? And verse number 26, arise. Now notice this, with all that going on, as dark as that valley is, has painful and agonizing that situation had to be. And sometimes we're in that situation. He says, arise for our help and redeem us for thy mercy's sake. Now that word mercies would be better translated steadfast love, which really comes out of the covenant love. Tremendous Psalms. I think if we're really thinking through this in our prayer life, if you're reading the Psalm, it's going to make a tremendous difference on how we approach God in our prayers. What a great Psalm! It's not a fun Psalm, but it's a great Psalm. It's a Psalm of reality, and sometimes these are the things that we need to hear. Sometimes, don't we? So this is the Psalm tonight, and then of course tomorrow, as we're going through this path on the Psalms, and we're already in Psalm 45. I hope these studies are helping you. They're helping me, and looking at prayer from a completely different perspective. I think that as we study the Psalms, and I hope you are, that we'll learn to pray in a very good way. So see you tomorrow. We'll be looking at Psalm 45.